Welcome back to the Sky News Daily. Niall Paterson here. And if you're new to us, at 5 p.m. every weekday, we pull apart one of the big stories of the day with the Sky News reporters who are covering it, our experts and analysts, and some special guests too. So do make sure to give us a follow. That will ensure you're with us every day. Feel free to do a review as well, and you can get in touch. Sky News Daily at sky.uk is the email. You can even hit me up on X at Sky News Neil. Now, changes to where defendants are held before they appear in court might sound like they won't affect most of us. But if you're a police officer, a victim of crime, or if you work in the legal system, those changes certainly do have an effect. Well, a little later, the Police Federation and the Prison Officers Association will be here to help us understand why. But our correspondent covering the government's emergency measure known as Operation Early Dawn is Becky Johnson, and Becky joins us from Rotherham. The government clearly believes that Operation Early Dawn is the solution. So what's the problem?
Well, it's a solution, if we could describe it that way. And the problem is, as we've known for quite some time, there is a crisis in prisons. Prisons are almost full. At times in recent months, they've been running with just less than 1% capacity available. So we know there's a huge issue with overcrowding and simply not enough spaces in prisons. Now, when you combine that with the large-scale rioting that we've seen this summer in the UK, suddenly there has been an influx of hundreds of people into the criminal justice system. Many of them are being remanded into custody. Many of them are being processed extremely quickly, given prison sentences. And of course, this adds to a prison crisis that was already, many would say, at breaking point.
Ultimately, it essentially deals with where people are before they go to court. Just take us through it.
So when somebody's arrested, they get questioned in a police station, and then at some point they may or may not be charged. Now, normally, once somebody is charged, they are supposed to appear at magistrates' court at the earliest possible opportunity. The outcome of that will either be that they are released on bail pending further court hearings, or that they are remanded into custody. Now, clearly, there has to be a place in custody for them to be remanded into if that's the outcome. So what Operation Early Dawn does, and this is a measure that has been used before, it's not new, it is an emergency measure. It means that people who've been charged by police are to be held in police cells, so in police custody, and not taken to court until there is a place for them in prison, should the decision of the court be to remand them into custody.
It does sound like a combination of the courts, the police, and indeed the prisons are essentially having to get together and work out who might stand a chance of going to prison at the end of the day, and only if there is a place available for those people would those individuals be getting sent to court, which suggests to me that there might be quite a few people who are being let out of the police station as well as a result of this.
The National Police Chiefs Council and the government are at pains to say that people will still be arrested, that the public won't be put at risk because of this, i.e. dangerous people won't be released on bail. But look, practically what this means is that once somebody is charged, they cannot be taken to court until there is potentially a prison place available for them, should the decision of the court be to remand that person into custody. Well, how long can we actually hold somebody in a police cell once they've been charged without a court appearance? Those custody suites are going to have to be manned by people. That takes police away from their regular work.
It could be argued that it is not necessarily the fact that the riots took place and the police arrested a lot of people this summer that is the problem. It is the direction from the government that those people arrested on the riots needed to be processed at speed through the system and end up in jail just as soon as possible as a deterrent effect.
There's been a huge amount of public debate over the sentences that are being handed down, over the speed at which people involved in the riots are being processed through the courts. But as you say, a large element of that is the deterrence factor. I think we also need to talk about another measure that had actually been introduced by the government before the riots, but won't actually come into force until next month. Now, that is the prison early release scheme. Prisoners will be released after serving 40% of their sentence instead of 50% to serve the rest on licence, except in the case of things like domestic abuse and some serious crimes. But the problem for the government is these riots happened, huge numbers of people remanded into custody before that measure had come into force. We think, thousands of people will be released earlier than normal. So that is going to free up thousands of places. So in a sense, this Operation Early Dawn is a sticking plaster, really, in the hope of everybody within the system that this is going to get the system through until that point when more prison space will become available.
Becky, thanks very much indeed. So clearly some pretty significant problems that we are facing in terms of the prison service. The police are picking up the slack to an extent. Will it work? Well, two people who might have an idea. Mark Fairhurst, the National Chair of the Prison Officers Association. Phil Jones, Custody Lead at the National Police Federation, also himself a police sergeant. Mark, to you first. We have been here before, haven't we, with Operation Early Dawn. I mean, does it work? Does it do what it's supposed to do?
It does from our point of view, because our prisons are at capacity levels and we're quite concerned that we won't be able to provide prison places for everyone. So Operation Early Dawn, what it does in effect is we transport to court only those people that we think will end up in prison, and we can guarantee a prison space somewhere in the country. Of course, what it does do, it clogs up police cells, so it affects how effective they are with their business.
Phil, how difficult is it for you and your colleagues when you are in essence being asked to act as a wing of the prison service?
As we're seeing with NHS, when your A&E is full and you can't pass those patients to other departments within the hospital, everything grinds to a halt, and that's quite similar with the police service. We have to free custody cell blocks up so we can cater with business as usual and demand in order to keep the communities safe. And cells are being dedicated for prisoners coming out of courts. And whilst they're in police custody, those cells ordinarily aren't then available for when they are needed.
But Phil, is it possible for business as usual, as you put it, to carry on? Is it the case that police officers out there on the front line doing the day job, that they will not have at the back of their mind capacity in cells and police stations when it comes to deciding who and who not to put in handcuffs and in the back of the van?
There's a wider issue here around, not just with policing, but with the prison service, around lack of investment. Policing is still suffering from the after effects of years and years of lack of investment, and difficult decisions have had to be made by police and crime commissioners, chief officers around closing police stations, custody facilities. So actually, since 2010, we've seen reductions, I would suggest, in custody capacity. Police officers won't have in the back of their minds what spaces are available because they want to go and keep the community safe, lock people up who've committed offences. But if we can't move those prisoners on, undoubtedly there is a consequence of that.
Mark, just though from the point of view of those working in the prisons, this liaison, this kind of multi-agency triaging that is going on. I mean, when we say we're talking about people who are likely to receive a custodial sentence or indeed be taken in on remand, I mean, that covers a huge amount of offences, doesn't it?
It does, but under this Operation Early Dawn, only those who will probably be guaranteed actually of getting convicted or remanded will go to court. So it's only the most serious offenders will actually end up in court for that appearance. And under Operation Safeguard, which is where we commission those police cells, I think we've commissioned about 500 throughout the country, and there's 300 in use in the northeast and northwest, which is the pinching point at the moment. We give the police a couple of weeks' notice that this is going to happen. But what they have to decide if a prisoner doesn't go to court today is, are they going to hold him overnight again? Because ideally, we only want prisoners in police cells for a maximum of 24 hours. And if they do hold them overnight, will there be a court appearance tomorrow? Because if there isn't, their dilemma is, well, what do we do now? Do we bail them or do we wait another 24 hours? Because, Phil, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the maximum time you're allowed to hold someone is 72 hours and you have to gain permission for that. So this is a short-term measure. We only need to get through the next 3 weeks till the 10th of September, because on the 10th of September, there'd be at least 2,000 prisoners getting released in one foul swoop because they've served 40% of their sentence.
Phil, just pick up on that. How long can you hold on to people in those police cells? And how do you make those judgments? Because at some point, you potentially could have to put people back on the streets that you, your colleagues, and indeed those working in the prison service would rather not.
This isn't a new dilemma. We risk assess. We consider the risk to the public every day when we're looking at charging individuals and looking for those remand applications. We have people within the community who are a risk to the community, but there's sufficient mitigation to negate that risk. And that's happening here and now. You look at, for example, sex offender management is a prime example. Prolific offenders, we manage those within the community to minimise harm, minimise risk, and that's something that we may have to consider where measures aren't working effectively to get people to the courts. But there's a wider context to this as well. Police officers are police officers. They're not prison officers, and prison officers are a specialist in their field. Police custodies have the most vulnerable people coming into the estate, people with addiction, mental health problems, who need that support that the prison service give them once they land with the prisons, and the police aren't geared up or have sufficient infrastructure in place to support that in the medium to long term.
What are your concerns about managing, as you say, a larger number of some of the most troubled people in society?
We've got a finite number of resources that we know. Predominantly the commitments are going to be staffed with either the officers on ordinary duty, so they're going to be diverted away from dealing with 999 calls or the demands for their services. They're going to be put into custody, being de facto custody detention officers or prison officers, or it's those officers who've been manning the public order shields over the last couple of weeks who've been exhausted through the demands placed on them, who are going to be doing that through overtime or being diverted from other duties. So we haven't got another pot of officers available. It's drawing upon those officers who are already exhausted and tired through other commitments, but also who haven't had the thorough training as such to be glorified kind of prison officers.
I recall the last time this happened, and I think it was the early 2000s when we used police cells because we were full. And they gave us as prison officers overtime to work in police cells to supervise the prisoners in their care. And that worked quite well, but Phil's quite right. The last thing we want is police diverted from the streets to look after prisoners in their own cells. And there's a different dynamic. We have a fairly positive relationship with prisoners because they're not as volatile towards us as they are towards the police. The police arrest them. The police investigate them, they charge them, then they judicially send them down. We're the last port of call. So there's a different dynamic there. And prisoners don't want to end up in police cells, by the way, for prolonged periods, because police cells are really sparse. There's no TVs, there's no comfy beds. You can't eat food in a police cell, there's no showers. So they don't want to end up there either. So it does create a bit of a knock-on effect, all this.
Mark, Phil, let's pause there for just a second. When we come back, we will once again be looking at solutions. Is there a way out of this crisis within Britain's prisons? Welcome back. We are continuing to talk about Operation Early Dawn, the government's emergency plan to avoid overcrowding in our prisons. Well, our prisons are pretty much at that point already, but then after a summer of rioting and a government wanting to see justice being done very, very quickly indeed, the problems have multiplied. Mark Fairhurst, National Chair of the Prison Officers Association, and Phil Jones, Custody Lead at the National Police Federation, himself a police sergeant, are both still with us. I mean, Mark, ultimately, all the problems that we're experiencing, all the triggers that have led to Operation Early Dawn being instituted, can they all be traced to the problems that the prison estate is experiencing?
Yeah, this goes back to the coalition government, then the Tory government, way back in 2010. They brought in austerity measures. The prison service had to make £900 million worth of savings. They closed 20 public sector prisons, which lost 10,700 prison cell spaces, and we lost over 100,000 years of experience. Experienced officers were allowed to leave on voluntary exit schemes. They brought in new terms and conditions where the wages were a pittance, so that created a staffing crisis. And of course, when there was less staff around, there was more violence in prisons because prisoners took advantage of that situation. We've never recovered from that, and will we ever? I really don't know.
Phil, I'm wondering from the point of view of the day job, you're a sergeant in the police force. I mean, do you perceive that this Operation Early Dawn will have an effect on the victims of crime?
I think any release of offenders, whether that's sooner, has an impact on the victims. And also, yes, we are looking at kind of low-level offending, whether that be shoplifting, things like that. But what we have to also recognise is that prolific offenders, shoplifters, cause misery economic crime-wise on businesses, but also people who go and visit those businesses and alike. It's a real difficult one, because by releasing people early, you may inadvertently be causing more demand again, because they may not have been rehabilitated or got the support networks in place to prevent them offending again once they're released back into the community.
And Mark, as all of us chatting right now well know, I mean, away from the fast-track process that we're seeing for those who were involved in the riots, the criminal justice system is ground to a halt, hasn't it?
Yeah, the entire criminal justice system, from prisons to police to probation to the courts, we're all on our knees. We've been underinvested in for at least a decade, and something needs to change long term. The new government need to look at sentence and policy, what type of people we send to prison. I mean, they've carried on the mantra that the Tories announced of the prison build programme, and they've earmarked £4 billion for new prisons. Well, the problem with building new prisons is you're always going to fill them. I would want that money diverted, scrap the new build policy, divert that £4 billion, increase mental health care in the community. So we've got mental health beds for people who need them, because our prisons are clogged up with people with acute mental health conditions who really shouldn't be in prison, but there's nowhere else to put them. So we could divert that money there. We could divert it towards a probation service that is understaffed and under-resourced and overworked. We incarcerate a lot of females for fairly minor crimes because maybe they've got addictions or they need to feed their families. Could we do something better with them? And then we've got the IPP prisoner scandal, where prisoners have been wallowing in prison for decades now over their tariff date because they're in for an indeterminate sentence for public protection. There's about 3,000 of them in the system. They can't all be a risk to the public. So there are lots of options. But this all comes down to investment from a government. And let's be honest, prisons aren't sexy. Whenever politicians stand up in the House, they mention the NHS, they mention the police. Nobody ever mentions prisons because we're behind a big grey wall and we're forgotten about. So it needs to change. You can't have justice on the cheap. And this proves it.
I suppose this then begs a question of both of you. Phil, you first. Was it right, therefore, for the government to decide to prosecute those who were involved in the riots in this fashion, knowing that there would be an additional burden placed on the courts process, knowing that there would be an immediate burden placed on the prisons and, as is transpired, on the police?
I mean, ultimately, what we would like to see is everybody dealt with in a consistent way, that they do, the victims do get speedier justice and penalties are handed out as a more realistic and effective way. And that's what we've seen. Yes, there are consequences of that, but if you have the means to cater for the demand, then we've seen how the system works effectively, and that should be then cascaded out across the rest of the criminal justice system.
Long term, as I say, policy needs to change. We need to look at what we can do for people with addictions, what we can do for people serving shorter sentences, instead of sending them to prison at a cost of £1,000 a week. I mean, when I joined a job in 1992, we were locking up just over 40,000 offenders. We're now locking up 88,000. When's it going to end? We've got to do things differently.
And Phil, I wonder if we might conclude by you popping your sergeant's hat on just for a second. Of course, there will be a number of people who will be listening to this who will be concerned. Who will be concerned that people are being stored in cells that are unsuitable, that people are being released from prison earlier than expected. I suppose, it's at times like this that you and your colleagues on the thin blue line, these are the moments where you guys have to step up and do even more and reassure the public that, their safety will not be compromised.
I mean, absolutely. Policing often steps up in the time of crisis. We'll do the same as we have done before. We'll be at the forefront of it. We'll support the communities. We'll support the criminal justice system to make it as safe as possible for those coming into police custody, making that transition to the prison service as smooth as we can, recognising the challenges that are there for us. But my members go out every day doing the best that they can for colleagues, the public, and they'll continue to do so.
That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. Don't forget, you can email us, skynewsdaily@sky.uk. You can find me on Twitter @SkyNewsNeil, Neil spelt, of course, Niall. But we'll be back again tomorrow. See you then.